A few years back, we had a problem at our house. I was sitting in our living room, which kind of faces where I was sitting. You can see into our dining room. And I was sitting there, and I looked up, and I noticed that we had this like collage. There were a couple small mirrors and a picture kind of in the center of the wall. And I looked up, and one of the mirrors was gone, just not there. And in its place was a weird colored spot. So I went in there to investigate what was happening, and I found the mirror on the floor with the back of it kind of, it was held up by like command strips. And what had happened was the back of it had kind of disintegrated because it was really, really wet. The spot on the wall was like dark moisture. Like, oh man, this isn't good. So I'm not incredible at this kind of stuff, but I know my way around construction enough to know this is bad. So I start to investigate, and that did not lead to better results. Pulled off the mirror and the picture, and both of them just soaking wet on the back. Really, really bad. I start feeling the wall. It's an old house. It's plaster and lath wall. The wall is wet. I'm like, oh man, if the plaster and lath is wet, that's bad. So I'm thinking, oh man, it's an interior wall in the downstairs, but upstairs, it's kind of there's a back porch that backs up to it. And so in the upstairs, it's right where I am, is right below one of our bedroom windows. Like, oh man, I bet that window's just been letting water in. So I call we rent our house, so I call our landlords, and I'm like, hey, we've got what I think is probably a really big problem here. So they send out some people to look at it, and our landlords, they're awesome people. We actually rent, it's an old parsonage, which is a house that a church owns and their pastor lives in. So our landlords are the board at this church. And their general mode of operation when they come to check out anything is this. Yeah, that's a problem. So they didn't do that, fortunately. They sent out somebody to look at it. So they start checking out the wall, and they're like, man, yeah, this is potentially really, really bad. We're going to have to take part of the wall out to kind of get in there and see what's going on, right? So they start to tear the wall out, and what they find is that there's been water in this wall at this point for probably months and months and months. There's mold all in the wall, and so like it was so bad that the mold remediation company had to quarantine off that room of our house for like 2 weeks. And bring in all their fancy fans and, air cleaning equipment and blah, blah, blah. We couldn't even enter the room for a couple of weeks. And it was a nightmare. I mean, it was terrible. And that might seem like an odd story to lead with in us doing a series on doubt, but stick with me because that mold theme is going to come into play all throughout the message today, because doubt is a lot like the mold that was in our wall. What I mean is, doubt is something that on its own isn't necessarily a terrible thing. A little bit of mold, I mean, any of us that live in older homes, there's probably a little bit of mold somewhere in that house. And I know, like, those of you that are worriers are like, please don't say that. Well, it's probably true. But the reality is a little bit is not that big of a deal. But when it gets to the point that ours got to, that's a bad thing. That has to get cleaned out. And doubt is similar in terms of, if there's a little bit of doubt, if you're wrestling with some doubt, that's not in and of itself a bad thing. But when doubt gets out of control like that, it can become a very, very bad thing that has to be taken care of. And so last week, as we started this series, I kind of let it off by talking about the fact that there are really two roads that we can walk down with doubt. The first road is a road that leads toward destruction. And the other road is a road that leads toward a deepening of our faith. So we can either walk a road to destruction of faith or a road to the deepening of our faith. And I told you last week that essentially the goal for the rest of the series, beginning today, is that we're going to take 3 weeks, and I'm going to try to help you understand how to make sure you walk down the road that leads to a deepening of faith and not a destruction of faith. Now, this mold idea is important today because we're going to talk about the idea of deconstruction. You may or may not be familiar with the idea of deconstruction or what it is as it relates to faith, but it's a really important concept. And it's an important concept that has become much more common in kind of church leadership circles over the last probably decade and a half. I don't recall growing up ever hearing people talk about deconstruction of faith, but it's become something that's talked about a lot now amongst pastors and church leaders, because increasingly more and more, those of us who are in leadership positions in churches are seeing people that we love and care about who are deconstructing their faith, but rather than deconstructing in a way that leads to deeper faith, they're deconstructing in a way that leads to the destruction of faith. And so my goal today as we talk about deconstruction is to help you see that deconstruction to me is in a lot of ways a really important signpost to determine what road am I on. In other words, there's some specific clues we can look at when it comes to the deconstruction process. And as we're going to talk about more, the reality is that everybody deconstructs faith in some way or another at some point in time. But there's some things that we can look at when it comes to deconstruction to really determine what road am I on. And so that's what we're going to take a look at today. Now, if you're not super familiar with deconstruction, I'm going to offer a definition to you. I mentioned last week at the end of the message that I'm kind of loosely basing this series on this book called The Benefit of Doubt by Pastor Craig Groeschel. That graphic probably looks familiar because we're using the same graphic. I'm kind of loosely basing what I'm doing off this book. I'm not using a ton from it, but one thing I am going to use is I'm going to adopt the definition that he gives for what deconstruction is. And so if you're not super familiar, I would offer this up to you. Deconstruction is a sincere examination of your beliefs, letting go of what is untrue to build on what is true. All right? That's kind of the place we're going to work from in understanding what deconstruction is. It is a sincere examination of your beliefs, letting go of what is untrue to build on what is true. Now, to be clear, deconstruction can also be the opposite of that. Deconstruction can be letting go of what is true and building on what is untrue. It can be. Doesn't have to be, but it can be. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at how to make sure it's this. How do we make sure that when we deconstruct, because we all will deconstruct parts of our faith at points in time, how do we make sure that it is this, that we are letting go of what is untrue so that we can build on what is true? Now, deconstruction is important because it is a dangerous thing, but it is a necessary thing. And anything that is dangerous but necessary has the potential to turn out badly. And I say that because, again, I've said it a couple times even here. Now, we all go through periods where we deconstruct parts of our faith. We do. For some people, they go through and they deconstruct almost all of their faith. For other people, they only deconstruct little bits and pieces of their faith. But we all go through stages where we deconstruct parts of our faith. In a practical sense, what I mean is we all have seasons in our lives where we think about our faith and we realize, oh, there's this thing that I believe, I'm not sure that's true. And so then maybe we dig in a little bit. We start to examine and we start to ask questions. And we have to grapple with, is what I was believing true or is it untrue? And that process of deeply examining fundamentally held beliefs is what deconstruction is. And again, if you walk with Jesus for any period of time, you're going to do that at some point, whether big or small. But depending on the road you walk down with it, it will tremendously shape what ends up happening with your faith in the long run. So, there's a biblical principle that we've got to get out of the way as we begin to talk about this idea. It's a principle that's in a few different places, but we're going to take a look at the book of Ecclesiastes today to see this principle at play. And Ecclesiastes is known as wisdom literature in the Old Testament. It's a book of just a lot of wisdom. And so there's this one particular part of Ecclesiastes in chapter 3 that is fairly... It's fairly famous. It's fairly well known. You may have heard bits and pieces of it. I've shared bits and pieces of it here. We're going to read through the whole thing, but there's two specific parts that we're going to kind of zero in on today. So the writer of Ecclesiastes says this: there is a time for everything, and there's a season for every activity under the heavens. There's a time to be born, and there's a time to die. There's a time to plant, and there's a time to uproot. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. And here's one of the first ones that I want us to look at. There's a time to tear down, and there's a time to build. They continue, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. There's a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away. And here's the second, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Now, again, this is a relatively famous portion of the Bible, and it's important because it highlights a critical truth to our lives. There are seasons for everything. There's times in life where we've got to live, and there's times that we've got to die, and there's times that we've got to build up, and there's times that we've got to tear down, and there's times that we've got to mend, and there's times that we've got to heal, and there's times to speak and times not to, and times to embrace and times not to, which is like introvert heaven. Right? The not embrace time, the not talk time. There's times for all these different things. And what the writer of Ecclesiastes does not say is for some people there's a time too. Like this is just universal. There's times in our lives there's seasons in our lives where we've got to be in one of these spots and times in our life where we've got to be in the other. And it's easy for us sometimes to look at kind of the more negative aspects of some of these pairs and think, well, if I'm in that spot, that's bad. But it's not. It's just reality. When we find ourselves not in a season of building up or a season of mending, when we find ourselves in a season of tearing down and of tearing, that feels bad, but it isn't necessarily bad. In fact, it's necessary in life. When it comes to the mold in our house, if we had not torn that mold out, it would have caused major problems. It would have been a bad thing. And when we think about it in terms like that, it makes sense. If you buy a fixer-upper, you don't buy a fixer-upper to just paint over the mess. You buy a fixer-upper to tear it apart and to rebuild it. And it's because what exists needs to be better. And in all kind of ways, this principle applies, and it makes sense to us, except when it comes off into faith. And this is something that we talked briefly about last week, but again, I think is something the church, not City North per se, but the church broadly, maybe the churches that you grew up in, that we've gotten really wrong over time. We've had a tendency to say, well, if you're doubting, just have more faith. Doubt equals bad, so have more faith. But the reality is when we just stuff the doubt, when we just pretend the doubt isn't real, what we do is short circuit the process of tearing out the ugly parts so that we can rebuild better. And the truth is that for all of us, we've all got some mold in our faith. Every one of us. Every one of us. And so it makes what Ecclesiastes is teaching us super, super critical. The truth is, the reality is, when it comes to our lives in general, but especially when it comes to our faith and to doubt, there are seasons to tear down the bad so we can build the good. There are seasons that we must tear down the bad to rebuild the good. It's absolutely 100% critical and necessary. Vanessa and I have been talking about buying a house this year, and so we've been starting to talk about like the various things that are, kind of the non-negotiables. And she said something the other day that was really funny. She said, Andrew, one of my non-negotiables is a good refrigerator. And she said, we've never had a good fridge, have we? And I was like, no, we have not. We've had crappy ones for our entire adult lives. So I'm on board with a good fridge. At one point when we lived in Kentucky, the house that we owned there, our fridge went out. It was an old fridge, and so we pulled it out, and getting a new fridge is like one of the most annoying experiences in life, because it's so urgent. It's got to happen right now. At least for those of us that are practical about money, you're like, I'm not going to waste all this food. So I start to measure the opening, and the measurements it's a tiny opening. So, when the fridge first went out, we're like, oh, cool, we can get a nice fridge. Well, as it turns out, the measurements wouldn't allow for that. And so we had to buy a really narrow fridge that was terrible. Now, we could have torn the wall out between the kitchen, but that's a whole nother thing. But look, that's the idea, right? Like, the truth is, anytime we want something better in our lives, if we keep kind of with this construction metaphor, we got to tear down something that's not the way it should be in order to build something the way we want it. And the simple truth is it's the same way in our faith. For a lot of us, there's some mold in our faith. And for most of us, we don't even know the mold's there. Because there's these belief systems, there's these worldviews, there's these little things, there's these theologies that maybe we were taught growing up, maybe we're reinforced by our friends, maybe our mom and dad deeply believed them. There are these things in our faith that we've heard, that we've been taught, but that aren't super healthy. And in a lot of cases, we don't even know. And so I wrote down a list of 3, just kind of off the top of my head, 3 things that on their own aren't necessarily bad, but if we're not careful with them, if they start to grow, they can become a mold that infests our faith and can lead to deep doubt. One of them is that there are many, many people in the world, and you might be one who believes this. So bear with me for a sec, because I don't want to step on toes too much. But there are a lot of people in the world that believe that every single word written in the Bible was written by God himself. They weren't. Now, if somebody wants to argue with me that the original Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek words were like God wrote them, I don't agree with you, but I can kind of get behind that. But if you want to argue that the English translations we have were written word by word by God, no. And it's real easy to prove that. I could show you 2 different translations that say very different things in English, because there is an interpretive dance that has to happen in trying to figure out how to translate these old English or these old languages into modern day English that we can understand. And so people that approach, one of the biggest red flags for me when I'm talking to somebody about faith is if they say, well, the Bible very clearly says, because often it doesn't. And if it's an English version, it's like, well, are you using the NIV, or are you using the NASB or the ESV or the King James or the New King James or the NIV 84 or the NIV 2011? And some of you are like, what are all these letters? That's the point. Okay? Look, at the end of the day, the Bible wasn't written specifically by God to us. And when people take that approach, it can lead to all kinds of bad places. It's not bad in and of itself, but it can lead to some real unhealth in people's faith. Another one, maybe this is a phrase that you're familiar with. God helps those who help themselves. Anybody ever heard that one? That isn't in the Bible. Not there. Like anywhere. It's not there. Now, there's some things that kind of communicate little tiny bits of that idea, but that's not there. And in fact, that belief system, if you really employ that and live it out day to day, what it ends up becoming, or can become, I should say, what it can become is it can become you playing God instead of allowing God to be God. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying, well, you should be active in your faith. Like, you should be working in your faith. That's true. But to say God helps those who help themselves as if it's biblical truth, it's just flat out not. The third one that I wrote down that has a lot of bearing on doubt is it's common to hear people say some version of, God won't give you more than you can handle. Anybody ever heard that one? Also not in the Bible. Not there. It's not there. There are little bits and things that say, like, God won't tempt you beyond what you can bear, but it doesn't say he won't give you more than you can handle. In fact, the Bible, Jesus himself openly talks about how life's going to be really, really hard. And one of the core tenets of faith in Christ is this understanding that in my humanity, I can't handle all that life's going to throw at me. I need the power and the strength of God to get me through. And so the truth is to believe the idea that God won't give us more than we can handle, and then to apply that in our lives. Well, what happens when we have more than we can handle? Because there's going to come some day in your life where there's more than you can handle. All of a sudden now, if you believe that and you genuinely believe that's biblical, now you've got to wrestle with, well, maybe the God that I've believed in all these years isn't even real. When the truth is, it's not God that's not real, but it's that belief system that's false. And so for all of us, we have to go through these seasons where we examine the beliefs that we hold, we examine the truths that we ascribe to, and we very critically and thoughtfully say, is this real? Is this true? And to be really honest with you, I've gone through seasons of this in my life, and I've asked some deep fundamental questions of my faith. Now, there's a road you can walk down that, again, as we've talked about, leads to a deepening of that faith. But all of us have to deconstruct at some point in time. We have to tear down the problematic parts of our faith, the problematic belief systems. The question is, are we going to rebuild those stronger, or are we going to take a different approach? And I say that because really there's three approaches that we can take when it comes to faith, or when it comes to doubt, I'm sorry. There's three approaches that we can take. So let's go back to my mold story. There's three approaches we could have taken when it came to the mold. We could have painted over it, just slapped a new coat of paint on, render special. Slap a coat of paint on, forget about it. Never existed. In some cases, the results of that sort of decision, they're okay. In our scenario, it would have been disastrous because that mold just would have kept growing through the wall. Who knows how many other walls it would have ended up in, would have been a disaster. But that's an option. When it comes to our faith, when it comes to our doubt, when it comes to deconstructing, when we encounter doubt, when we encounter belief systems that now rub against reality, we have the option to just say, I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to pretend it's not real. If you've ever done that in your faith, what you know is that it doesn't make the doubt go away. It just covers the mold. And there comes some point in time where you can't ignore it any longer, and now the problem is exponentially bigger than it was in the beginning. And in my experience with a lot of people, that actually becomes the main problem with doubt, because rather than, as we're going to talk about more in a few moments, rather than engaging the doubt, they just cover the doubt thinking, well, now it's gone. And churches and Christians have made this so much worse because often our answer to questions of doubt is just have more faith. Just have more faith. Well, you just need to trust God more. And in reality, that's just slapping a coat of paint on the mold. It's not dealing with it. It's not digging into it. It's not exploring it. Trusting that God's big enough to handle it. No, it's slapping a coat of paint on it. The second option that we have is to burn the house down. To be very clear, if any of you were to ever find a snake in your home, and you were to ask my wife's opinion of what should be done with the house, the answer's simple: burn it to the ground. There's no other solution to a snake than burn the thing down, all right? Like legitimate, real phobia. You should not listen to her. You should not ask her opinion. God forbid, none of us are ever gonna be in that scenario because that's no fun. If you were, don't ask her opinion because that's going to be what she tells you and it's bad advice, okay? When we found the mold, we could have burned our house down. Would have been a bad decision, but would have got rid of the mold. No more mold problem, gone. That we don't have a home now, but the mold's gone. And as dramatic and drastic as that is when we talk about mold in a house, the reality is it's what a lot of people do with their faith. They encounter these doubts, and now to be clear, very few people start at burn the house down. But once they've painted the walls enough times and the mold problem's bad enough, for a lot of people, they get to a point where there really is no more option at this point. They just got to burn it down and their faith's gone. That's the worst case scenario. That's the road we don't want to walk down. But there is a third option. It's what we did with our mold. It's what you should do with yours, should you find any. It's to take care of it. It's to deal with the problem. It's to open up the walls and expose what's happening and treat it and eradicate it and rebuild it better. Now we see little bits of this through a couple stories in the Bible. There's actually quite a few places I could have pulled from here, but I mean, ultimately the question is, we all want to do number 3 of those options, but how? How do we make sure we are? So we're going to look at 2 passages today, one from the book of John and one from the book of Matthew. I actually referenced both of these passages last week in the sermon, but we didn't dig into them at all. So we're going to look at 2 passages today that on the surface very clearly deal with doubt, but there's more going on than you might see, and they'll give us some clues into how to deal with doubt and make sure that as we deconstruct, as we ask those difficult questions, that we land in the right place. So the first story is in the book of John, chapter 20. Now, to set this up, in this story, Jesus has risen from the dead. He's been crucified. He's risen from the dead. He's appeared to Mary. She has told the disciples that Jesus is alive. And Jesus has actually appeared to most of the disciples at this point, but not all of them. And the disciples are all together in a room and they're talking. And again, most of them have seen him, but there's at least one in the room that has not. And what we're going to do is look at his response to the news that Jesus has risen from the dead. John chapter 20, starting in verse 24. Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he, being Thomas, he said to them, "Look, guys, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and I put my finger where the nails were, and I put my hand into his side where the spear pierced him, I'm not going to believe." And this is a fair response. I would love to stand here and say, were I in Thomas's shoes, I'd have been like, "Oh, that's amazing. Jesus is risen from the dead." But I probably would have said what Thomas said, because people don't rise from the dead. Now, the disciples had seen Jesus raise people from the dead, but it's a whole different thing to raise somebody from the dead than for you to raise yourself from the dead when you're already dead. You know, that's a different thing altogether. And so I think it's fair that Thomas says, "I'm not sure about all this, guys. This does not seem like it's possible." That's what I probably would have said. That's what most of you would have said. And you're good Christians who believe in Jesus, you trust Jesus, but you would have been skeptical too, because this doesn't happen. I like the fact that Thomas is honest about his faith. I think that's important. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment, but before we do, we're going to look at the one other story. This is shortly after the story we just read. This one's found in the book of Matthew, and it's what's known as the Great Commission. Now, the Great Commission is a very famous part of the scriptures. I've shared it a ton in our church. I use it every time I teach Starting Point. It's very, very famous. It's Jesus' kind of final instructions to his disciples before he ascends into heaven. But did you know that right before Jesus tells them to go into all the world and make disciples, there was doubt? Like right before it. It's part of the story we don't often talk about. But this is what we find in Matthew chapter 28, starting in verse 16. Then the 11 disciples, 11 because Judas is no longer with them, then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, so now they're looking at him, they worshiped, but some doubted. Then Jesus said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And this is the part that's famous. This is the part I share in Starting Point. This is the part that you've probably heard at some point. "All authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. So now go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you always, even to the very end of the age." Now, this is an amazing passage to me for a couple reasons. One, we tend to equate doubt as a bad thing. This is one of the working theories of this entire message series. I've said it a lot. I'm going to keep saying it because I can't overstate the reality that while we view doubt as a bad thing, I don't think biblically there's grounds to say doubt is bad. It's what you do with doubt that is good or bad. And even here, Jesus, upon some of the disciples apparently doubting, Jesus could have, because he's God, he knows what they're thinking. He could have said, "Hey guys, I've got some really important instructions for you. Could you knock it off with the doubt? Because I'm about to leave forever. And I need you guys to carry this thing forward, but it ain't gonna work if you've got doubt." But he doesn't. I think it's incredibly powerful that right here we see that there are some who are doubting, and yet Jesus continues with the commissioning. He continues saying, "Hey, go do what I've asked you to do." He doesn't even address it. That's a pretty powerful reality. But more than that, again, to get back to the question at hand today, the question is, how do we make sure that when we have doubt, when we are deconstructing, when there is a necessary season of our lives to tear down the things that we struggle with so that we can rebuild a stronger faith, how do we make sure we do it right? There's two pieces that are in these two stories. Both of them show it. But there's two pieces that are critical to getting this right. But they're not on the surface. We've got to dig just a bit. The first thing is this: in both of these cases, there has been acknowledgement of an engagement with the doubt. What I mean is that in Thomas's case, he doesn't bury the doubt inside and go like, "Oh, well, the other 10 are saying that they've seen Jesus, so I guess I better not doubt that it's real." He speaks it. He voices it. He brings it out into the open. There's an honesty about the doubt. So in other words, to go back to our our three options to deal with the mold, Thomas doesn't just paint over the doubt. He doesn't ignore it. He doesn't pretend it's not real. When we look at the Great Commission, they see Jesus, but some doubted. These guys have all already seen Jesus several times at this point, the resurrected Christ. They've already seen him. They've talked with him. They've embraced him. They've hugged him. And yet they're still wrestling with it because it doesn't happen. But what's interesting to me is that the man who wrote this passage, Matthew was one of the 11 that was there that day. But Matthew doesn't say, then Jesus appeared and we all saw him and I doubted. He says, but some doubted. Now, why is that significant? Because it means they talked about it. They had to have talked about it. Or Matthew would have never known that there were others who were doubting. He couldn't have known unless they talked about it. Well, wouldn't you talk about it? I would. I'd be like, guys, oh my goodness. Listen, I've hugged him. I've seen the nails. I know, but like, is this real? Like, are you guys sure we're not in a dream? It's an important detail because the indication is that they talked about this. So in other words, the disciples who doubted didn't paint over their doubt either. They talked about it. And the reality is that if we're going to deal with deconstruction and with doubt in a healthy way and end up with a doubt that is stronger, we can't paint over the doubt. We must bring it out into the open and expose it. We must. There is no way to deal with doubt in a healthy way if it stays hidden inside of us. And it can be scary because we all deal with like an imposter syndrome of like, but I'm not supposed to doubt these things. And what if other people feel like I doubt? And am I like a worse Christian? And is God going to love me less? And all these things. But we can't rebuild health stronger. We can't rebuild something stronger that we don't tear out to begin with, if we don't tear out the unhealthy things. And so we have to deal with it. We have to do the work of deconstructing the bad parts. That's item number one that we see in these passages. The other thing that's important is we have to be conscious of who we involve in the process. We have to be. So when there was mold in our wall, I didn't call the guy that mows our lawn. Maybe he's a great mold expert. I don't know. My guess is he mows lawns. So we called somebody that does molding. We called somebody that does mold. If you've got a problem with your teeth, you don't go talk to your doctor about it. You go to a dentist. You've got to be aware of who's going to be able to help me deal with the issue at hand. And in both of these passages, what we see is that Thomas voices his doubt to his friends. The rest of the disciples, at whatever point they were expressing their doubt, they were doing it within a community of people who were going to be able to help them rebuild the right way. In my experience, the number one determining factor of whether or not people's faith falls apart in the process of deconstruction are the people they deconstruct with. It is the number one determiner in my experience. In other words, if you're doubting and you go talk to people who have already deconstructed and have burned the house down and have left faith, you're well on the road to burning the house down yourself. You just are. It doesn't have to be that way, but it is mostly that way. Because what they're going to do is present you with evidence and present you with thoughts and present you with their journey. And in the end, they're going to be like, look, snake equals bad, burn the house down. Doubt equals bad. God let this happen, God let this happen, God didn't answer your prayer, God did this, God did that, God did this other thing. The Bible says this, the Bible says that. Well, science says this and science says that. It's all a load. You got to just get rid of it all. But if you deconstruct with people who can help you rebuild the right way, then you can rebuild stronger. This is so much of my own journey, and I didn't even realize it at the time, but several years ago, about 11 years ago now, when I was kind of in this really dark season of my life, I was deconstructing a lot of parts of my faith, and I didn't even realize at the time it was happening. And I had never lost faith in God, to be clear. I never did, but I was struggling with him. Like, he and I were fighting. And as we did, I would talk. There were two friends in particular that I would talk to about my wrestling and my struggling. Both of them were strong Christian men. And what I didn't realize at the time was happening was that I was getting all this stuff out, and as I was expressing my doubt, I already knew what the truth was, but I was just wrestling with God. And so as I was wrestling with all this doubt, and as I was expressing it all, they were able to reinforce what I knew to be true, but I wasn't feeling. And in the end, what God proved to me was that he was with me and was never going to leave me. And he demonstrated that to me through two guys who loved me in my doubt and let me doubt, but also at certain points in time, told me things that I didn't really want to hear, but I needed to, about my own wallowing in my stuff, you know? And so here's the point. I say all this not because just the Bible tells me so or whatever, but I say this because I have experienced this and I have watched it happen over and over and over with people that I know. And so what do we do to make sure that we're going to walk down the right road? Well, it's pretty simple. There's the two things we see in the stories. You must deconstruct your faith. You must deconstruct your doubt. You must deconstruct your doubt. If you have doubts, you have to deconstruct it. You have to examine it and look at it and ask hard questions. You must. It is necessary. But if you want to end up on the right road, you must deconstruct your doubt with people who can help you reconstruct your faith. In my experience of nearly 20 years in professional pastoral ministry now, that might be the number one key to ensuring that your doubt leads to deeper faith, not to destroyed faith. Surrounding yourself with people who can help you, who can remind you of what's true when you are forgetting, who, when you're doubting the goodness of God, can remind you of all that God has done in your life, who won't minimize your doubts, who won't tell you to paint over them, who will engage those doubts with you, but will engage them in a way that is productive and beneficial and good, who won't tell you, yeah, God's terrible because he did all these things to you, but who will remind you that God's not the one that did all those things to you. God's not the one that abandoned you. That was people. God's not the one that hurt you. That's people. But what if through all these things, what if God was actually with you? What if God was carrying you? What if God was working in ways that you can't see yet? And so, deconstruction is a necessity. We must walk through the process. We must tear down the parts of our faith that are not healthy, that are not strong. We must work through our doubts. If you paint over them, they'll come back. And they'll come back bigger and worse than ever. But you must do it with people who will help you reconstruct your faith. For us as a church, this is a lot of why we have things like small groups, is to give people an environment and an ability to build community in a way where eventually they can be real about deep things, about hard things. Where they can say, hey, I've got this friend, and I've been praying for him. And they're getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And God's not answering my prayers, and I don't understand, because they're a good person, and they're doing the right things, and they don't deserve this. And I can't make sense of how a good God could let these things happen. That's a fair question. That's a fair doubt. You got one of two ways you can handle it. One of three ways you can handle it. You can paint over it. You can burn the house down. Or you can get somebody in there to help you navigate it and figure out what's going on and how can we rebuild this. And so the reality is, for all of us, we must walk through this process. We will walk through this process at some point or another. It's just a matter of which approach we take, to paint, to burn it down, or to deal with it. What I know is that no matter the road you've walked, no matter the doubts that you have, no matter the doubts that you've painted over and pretended don't exist and are trying really hard to ignore but keep poking their ugly heads back out, whatever it looks like for you, what I know is that there is a way to eradicate the mold. There's a way to get rid of the doubt, and there's a way to build it back stronger. And if you'll go through the process of deconstructing in the right way, and if you'll do it with people who will help you build back up your faith, you can end up with a faith that is so much stronger than anything you ever knew possible. Now, to be clear, this is just one part of the process. And in the process, it's probably the least important. But it's necessary. What we're going to talk about next week and the following are the parts that if you don't do those, it won't ever work. If you don't do this, you might end up okay. If you don't involve people in the process, you might end up okay, but your chances are a lot lower. And so my hope is maybe for some of you that struggle with doubt, you might feel a freedom to express that doubt. Maybe for some of you, you might go talk to a small group leader or just somebody in a small group. You might go talk to a team leader, somebody that's invested in you. Maybe you want to set up a time to come talk to me, because to be real honest, one of my very favorite things to do is sit down and talk to people about their doubts. I love it. I love it because I know the road and I know what it's like to feel alone. And so maybe that's what it is. But regardless, we've all got a choice to make. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but there will come a day where the doubt gets too big and where you run the risk of burning it all down. And so be proactive, take a step, talk to someone you love, talk to someone you trust. Most importantly, talk to someone who you love and trust spiritually, who you can look at their life and go, well, man, if I ended up in a place like them, more like them in 5 years, my faith was more like theirs, I would be thrilled by that. Because they will be someone who is able to help you navigate and walk through and help you tear out what is bad to rebuild what is good. And when we do that, we can end up with a faith that is stronger than ever before. So let me pray for us today.